So we're on part 5 of chapter 25, the Cold War, the breakdown of the Alta system. So the Sino-Soviet dispute. Khrushchev, he's saying he believes in this peaceful coexistence with the West, but it's going to weaken with the Soviet-China relationships. Mao, after Stalin died, he really believed that he should be the next leader of communism around the world. But Khrushchev doesn't see that. I mean, why would you? You're the leader. And so Mao wanted the Soviets to push for world revolution and aid him in recovering Taiwan. But remember, Taiwan is being controlled by Khrushchev. He's there with the Republic of China. And so what you kind of see is this tension between China and the Soviet Union starting. So in the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam War, those Geneva Accords had promised national elections to Vietnam. So they were supposed to be able to get their actual elections. But now some of the people might have actually done a democracy. Some of the people might have really went to a communist nation. So when you promise free elections, if you're a dictator or if you're somebody who's holding on to power because you're corrupt and you're holding on with all your might, and that means you're probably repressing free speech, you don't really allow national elections to be held, or at least not honest ones. So the anti-communist Dem is going to refuse to hold elections because he thought that Ho Chi Minh would win the elections. So out of his fear, he's going to repress the free elections. Now, Dem is going to get backed by the United States of America, so we're going to back him, and that means we back South Vietnam, because North Vietnam is being controlled by Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh is going to turn to a revolution to kind of solve this problem, and he's going to use his Viet Cong army, or the Vietnamese communists. And so the Viet Cong army is, they fight different. They're going to fight with guerrilla tactics. So by 1963, South Vietnam seems to be on the edge of collapse. And Kennedy is watching this, and he's just had the Bay of Pigs invasion. He's just had the Cuban Missile Crisis. He is trying to get reelected. So South Vietnam collapsing and falling to communism is not going to be something that is going to be okay. So the U.S. approves the overthrow of Dem. But the situation, instead of improving, because we thought if we got rid of this corrupt guy, that the situation would get better, that's not what happens. Instead, what happens is the situation actually gets far worse. So Lyndon B. Johnson is sworn in the president right after Kennedy dies, and he'll be the one that's elected in the election of 1964. So when Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the president, he's going to send the United States forces to Vietnam. So technically the United States is involved in Vietnam in 1965. So when we get involved in Vietnam, our troops go over there. Most of the troops who are in the Vietnam War, it's not a draft. They do have a draft, but most of the soldiers in Vietnam are volunteer soldiers. Yes, a good portion can be our draft army. Sorry, I had to pause the video and I don't know where I was, but I think I was with Johnson. So Lyndon B. Johnson, he's sending those soldiers in to combat. And so most of the military in Vietnam is really a volunteer army. You do have draft soldiers. So the role of China. Now, China's thinking about getting involved because communist Vietnam would help them out a lot. So there's some mixed feelings. A communist Vietnam was perhaps good for them, but it was also a threat of confrontation with the United States, who was a far more dangerous enemy. China is going to give verbal support to Ho Chi Minh, but they refuse to actually cooperate with Moscow in shipping Soviet goods to Vietnam through the Chinese territory. So the Soviet Union wants to help North Vietnam. They want to help Ho Chi Minh, but they got to go through Chinese territory in order to do this. But that's not going to work because Mao is not going to allow it. So with the Chinese not allowing the Soviets any real support, or the Vietnam any real support, they do it because they are fearful of an American retaliation against it. By 1968, there's a stalemate in the war. You got 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Lyndon B. Johnson has become an unpopular president. He did the civil rights stuff for the United States, so you see African Americans being able to vote. You'll see the desegregation of our facilities, our education, and everything. But By 68, Lyndon B. Johnson realizes that the war is hugely unpopular, and so he decides to not run for re-election. And so he doesn't run for re-election, and Richard Nixon is going to be voted in as the new president of the United States. So Richard Nixon promises to end the war. His policy is called Vietnamization. Vietnamization is the gradual removal of soldiers from Vietnam. Instead of actually doing that once Nixon gets elected, what Nixon is going to do is he's going to bomb two neighboring countries of Vietnam called Laos and Cambodia. So this doesn't seem like a Vietnamization. You're not removing the soldiers if you're bombing other places, but he does it anyway. He gets, in a little bit of flack about it, and so then he really does start removing the soldiers. But he decides to go ahead and improve relationship with China, and he will visit China in 1972. So we're going to see the Vietnamization, the removal of our American soldiers, and you're going to see Nixon visiting China. And so we're going to open up trade again with China and communist China. And so in the 1970s, you're going to see a lot of Chinese goods coming into America, and that's where that global dependence is going to start. And really, it's global interdependence, but it's really global dependence because each economy is you have to have other countries trading with you. When America finally does pull out, the fall of Saigon is going to happen. So no political settlement between North and South Vietnam. In 1975, the North Vietnam Army, the Viet Cong Army, is going to resume the military offensive, and South will fall. During the Vietnam War, you have this thing called the Tet Offensive, and the Tet Offensive is the Viet Cong Army's offensive strategy. And what Ho Chi Minh basically says in the Tet Offensive is, you can kill one of my guys, but we will always be able to replace him. For every one of my guys that you kill, 10 more strong communist pro guys are going to come into his spot. So what the Tet Offensive shows America, and what it shows kind of the world, is Vietnam will fall to communism. It's not going to be something that we're going to be able to win. So the consequences of Vietnam really falling to communism is South Vietnam's destruction. It's a humiliation for the United States. I mean, it's a loss. We withdraw before South Vietnam falls, but we withdraw and then it falls. It's a strategic impact that's limited because of improved Chinese-United States relationships. So we do start to improve our relationships with China in the 70s, and it's because Nixon's opening up trade, and we're going to start easing these tensions with his détente policy. So formal diplomatic relationships are actually established in 1979. So we're going to look at this era of equivalence. So the Brezhnev Doctrine. So the Brezhnev is going to replace Khrushchev in 1964, and the Cold War tensions are going to now start to increase again in Eastern Europe. So Czechoslovakia in 1968 is going to become a hardliner on communism, and so socialism with a human face. And what that kind of means is the Soviet and the Warsaw Pact troops are going to crush any of the reform movements. So if you try and do anything that is maybe going to relax tensions, like what they try and do is they relax the tensions on the freedom of speech, press, and they allow people to travel abroad. The Soviet Union isn't going to be okay with that because it almost looks like, maybe Czechoslovakia is going to be a democracy eventually. That gets stopped immediately. You got to oust those people that are going to do that. East Germany is also going to have an issue. So East Germany, we get a very loyal Soviet satellite state under Ulbricht, and what the East Germans have been doing is they've been fleeing to the West Germany, and there is really not a fortified wall ever set up until 1961 when the Berlin Wall is built. This again is under Kennedy. So Kennedy, he's got the Berlin Wall, he's got the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's got the Bay of Pigs invasion. I mean, he's just got a lot of bad stuff going on at the time. So the Berlin Wall is going to be built because what you see is that a lot of these workers here, they were fleeing over here because there wasn't a wall. And when the wall is built, it's a militarized zone. So there'll be towers, there'll be barbed wire, there'll be landmines, They have dogs and people constantly patrolling it. So East Germany had the strong economy among the satellite states. East Germany, they'll have cars, and other Soviet satellite states aren't going to have that. So in East Germany, the economy is not great, but it's better than the other Eastern satellite states. West Germany is going to be more advanced because it's got the Western nations on its side. So here's what the Berlin Wall actually looks like. It eventually is taken down, and President Ronald Reagan is given credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall because he's going to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. But the Soviet Union is collapsing by that point. They've spent too much money in their military. Their economy is just terrible. And so there's no way that the Soviet Union or communism is going to be able to continue if you don't have money, so it will tear down that wall. So an end to détente, and détente, remember, is just the reduction of tensions between the Cold War opponents. So the United States and the Soviet Union were kind of easing tensions. We're going to have an anti-ballistic missile treaty. We also call this SALT, and SALT is just Strategic Arms Limitation Talk 1, and we'll have 2, so we'll have 2 of them. When you study U.S. history, you need to know what it's SALT. So the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks is going to be between the United States, between Nixon and the Soviet Union, where we agree we're not going to keep building up all these heavy nukes or all these heavy intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both sides are going to recognize the equivalence of balance between them. So we're going to try and balance our forces. At the Helsinki Agreement in 1975, the West is going to acknowledge the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and the Soviet and other signers are going to agree to recognize and protect human rights. This is an agreement that Gerald Ford signs, and this is one of the things that he's known for signing as the Helsinki Accords. So we're going to renew tensions in the Third World. There's the souring of Soviet-American relationships. The Soviets are going to have some influence in Somalia and Ethiopia. We're going to have Cuban troops in Angola. And the Soviet troops are going to be sent to Afghanistan. And this is kind of going to be an issue for us. And it's to protect a Marxist regime. So America will go ahead and train a lot of people, a lot of Afghans, to defeat the Soviet troops. So America is very concerned about the Persian Gulf oil fields. And because, Afghanistan is right there, there's a lot of oil, so we're a little concerned about that because at this point, by the 70s, America is dependent on foreign oil, particularly the Middle Eastern oil. And so President Jimmy Carter, he's going to do the Carter Doctrine. And this says the United States uses force to preserve access to oil. So we'll do what we can to keep our oil supply going. The Soviets are going to become more concerned with Islamic fundamentalism than oil, because the Islamic fundamentalism was a little extreme for them, and so they were afraid of a terrorist attacks or terrorist things. And you still see the Russia kind of fearful of these kind of attacks. So the fear in the United States is that the Soviets are attempting nuclear superiority rather than accepting equivalence. Sorry, phone call. So the Senate is going to refuse to ratify SALT II treaty agreements in 1979 because we're starting to think that maybe the Soviet Union might be trying to increase their tensions again. But you got to understand, by the late 70s, the Soviet Union doesn't have any money. So countering the evil empire, at least this is what Ronald Reagan is going to call it. So Ronald Reagan will now become the president in 1980, and he'll be a 2-term president, and he has a very harsh rhetoric with the Cold War. So he labels the Soviet Union an evil empire in the 1980s, and so he's going to build up the United States military. The United States military is huge during the 80s, a lot of pay raises too. And we get a new arms race. He's going to have Star Wars, which I know you guys are going to love, but he watches the movie and then he comes up with a plan. Who knows, okay? But anyway, he comes up with this plan called the Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI. And so what Star Wars, or SDI, is supposed to be is like we're going to get satellites in space and they're going to have rays that are going to shoot down nukes, I think. That's what he says. So this is what he's hoping is going to happen. Anyway, it is kind of futuristic, but I mean, it's a bluff Ronald Reagan is playing poker, and he just plays a better poker game than the Soviet Union. And so because the Soviet Union can't seem to actually go against that, like who's going to have nukes up there in space and shooting? I mean, it's just too much for the Soviet Union. They're going to tear down the wall, and the Soviet Union is starting to collapse. We're going to get the Contras, which we're going to look at, and the Sandistas in a later chapter. We're going to talk about that. But he's going to give very much some support to anti-Soviet insurgents. So Ronald Reagan is a hardliner on Soviet